lot of significant differences between movie Arwen and book Arwen. Namely, that movie Arwen is actually a character, and book Arwen is not. Okay, yeah, that was a pretty blatant exaggeration, but I figured that the title and thumbnail of this video already made people a little mad, so I would get them all the way angry so that they'd be angry enough to comment and boost me in the algorithm, so. But the reality is that they're two very different characters. They were written for two very different purposes in two very different stories, and digging a little bit deeper into both of these characters can teach us a lot about Tolkien, Peter Jackson, and the art of storytelling. I'm Jess, part-time hobbit, and today we're gonna take apart Arwen, her role in the books and in the movies, and how they ended up the way that they are. And thankfully for the runtime of this video, the amount of time that she spends in the actual text of The Lord of the Rings is pretty slim. We first meet her sumptuously described in the Fellowship of the Ring, where Frodo sees her in Rivendell. Young she was, and yet not so. The braids of her dark hair were touched by no frost. Her white arms and clear face were flawless and smooth, and the light of stars was in her bright eyes, gray as a cloudless night. Yet queenly she looked, and thought and knowledge were in her glance, as of one who has known many things that the years bring. But she doesn't talk at all in that scene, nor in the one that follows, where Frodo notices that she and Aragorn are a little, cozier than just friends. Arwen is mentioned a handful more times in Fellowship, usually in the context of Aragorn longing for her and reminiscing about her, but then we don't actually catch up with her again until the Return of the King. Before Aragorn goes on his trip to the Paths of the Dead to raise his ghost army, he's approached by some people that have just arrived from Rivendell, who come bearing a message and a banner that Arwen has been working on. It turns out that as much as Aragorn was agonizing over her absence, she was also thinking about him and weaving her message of hope for him into this new standard. And on the banner that she had woven, there flowered a white tree, and that was for Gondor. But 7 stars were about it, and a high crown above it, the signs of Elendil that no lord had borne for years beyond count. And the stars flamed in the sunlight, for they were wrought of gems by Arwen, daughter of Elrond, and the crown was bright in the morning, for it was wrought of mithril and gold. Aragorn first flies this standard at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and it acts as a turning point in the battle, the first revelation of Aragorn truly stepping into the role of king, and it's all because of this banner of hope that Arwen has woven for him. And then finally, at Aragorn's coronation, Arwen is the most highly honored guest. She arrives glimmering in the evening with stars upon her brow and a sweet fragrance about her. Frodo was moved with great wonder, and he said to Gandalf, "At last I understand why we have waited. This is the ending. Now, not day only shall be beloved, but night too shall be beautiful and blessed, and all its fear pass away." Why doesn't anybody ever say that when I walk into a room? Aragorn and Arwen are wed at midsummer, and it is truly a beautiful moment. This is pretty much the last we see of Arwen in the main text of The Lord of the Rings, but in Appendix A of The Return of the King, we get the whole backstory of her love story with Aragorn. I actually did a full video about their whole romantic story a couple of months ago, so check that out if you would like the long version, but here I am going to try and do the fastest summary ever. So basically, back when he was a kid, Aragorn's father died, and Aragorn got sent to live in Rivendell. Arwen isn't actually there when he arrives because she is on a trip staying with her grandma, but when she eventually does come back to Rivendell, it is love at first sight between her and Aragorn. This seems really cool, but Elrond comes up to Aragorn and is basically like, "Hey, she's like 2,000 years older than you, and also I think this might distract you from your mission of becoming king, so maybe this isn't so good of an idea." And Aragorn is like, okay, and goes on a 50-year road trip to discover himself. He and Arwen bump back into each other in Lothlorien after this 50-year road trip, and Arwen is still so into him that she promises to give up her immortal life so that she can be with him, and Aragorn is like, okay, that's cool, and then they agree to get married eventually, but not yet. Then The Lord of the Rings happens, and they get married, and they live pretty much happily ever after until Aragorn dies of being old, disease, and then Arwen consequently dies of being sad disease. So yeah, that was the a painfully reduced gist of what we get in the appendices. And while that whole story is truly gorgeous, especially when I'm not trying to tell the whole thing in 60 seconds or less, the fact is that it is relegated to the appendices. The majority of it occurs behind the scenes, and that also kind of goes for Arwen's character in general. And, well, I think there's a couple of reasons for why Arwen's character is presented the way it's presented. And now, I really struggled with how I should address this topic. Because once you start talking about Tolkien's women on the whole, you open up an entire can of worms that, quite frankly, I would like to save for another video. So I am going to do my best to avoid generalizing Tolkien's women in general, even if some of the stuff I'm discussing now could apply to them, especially avoiding the topic of Éowyn. So if it seems like I am not necessarily diving into some aspects of this or extrapolating on this stuff as much as I possibly could, that's because that's true. That's because that's what I'm doing. Let's begin with a brief overview of Tolkien's own relationships with real-life women. He had a mother whom he truly adored, but she died when he was only 12 years old. I believe that her death, especially so early on in his life, led to him idealizing her in some ways, especially considering that he wrote multiple times about thinking of her as a martyr in the context of the Catholic faith. He believed that her level of dedication to the Catholic faith is what led to her death, which is, you know, kind of debatable, but that's what he believed. And this martyrdom to the Catholic faith, as Tolkien saw it, led to him being an incredibly devout Catholic for the rest of his life, even in the face of adversity. I think that to Tolkien, his mother and faith were very intrinsically linked, something that meant that he ended up viewing her as a sort of saint. The other majorly important woman in his life was Edith Bratt. Tolkien met Edith when they were teenage orphans living in a boarding house, and they fell for each other pretty fast and pretty hard. However, Tolkien's guardian at the time decided to separate the two, banning Tolkien from seeing her as he thought that Tolkien was being distracted from his scholarly pursuits by Edith. Because of this, Tolkien yearned for her for 3 years, barely associating with any women his age due to his undying loyalty and dedication to this idea of Edith. But of course, once those 3 years were over and Tolkien had turned 21 and was no longer under the purview of his guardian, he and Edith were lovingly reunited. Although they were eventually brought back together, it's hard to deny that those first couple fundamental years of their relationship consisted primarily of Tolkien's own imaginings. It was a relationship made up of Tolkien thinking about Edith and longing for her, and much in a similar way to his relationship with his mother, his relationship with this woman was primarily defined by her absence from his life. And although it seemed that Tolkien and Edith were in love and generally happy for the rest of their lives together, their relationship was far from perfect. They had conflicts of faith, differing educational levels, very different lifestyles. And it seems that their separation during those early fundamental years of their relationship led to some social and communication problems between the two of them that they would never truly overcome. There's a whole chapter in Tolkien's biography that kind of dives deeper into the dynamics of their relationship, so I recommend you check that out. But one particular passage that stood out to me was how Edith saw Tolkien. She could see that one side of him only came alive when he was in the company of men of his own kind. Tolkien seemed to socialize with and befriend men much, much more easily than he did women. And considering his lifestyle and the historical context of his upbringing, it's unsurprising. In Tolkien's biography, Carpenter writes, "It was part of the spirit of the times. It had precedence in ancient civilizations, and closer at hand it was, in part, the result of the First World War, in which so many friends had been killed that the survivors felt the need to stay close together." Tolkien's life had been dominated by his relationships with men, his brother, his fellow soldiers, and as he advanced into the upper echelons of 20th century academia, his fellow scholars. There had never been particular means or opportunity for him to become close personal friends with women outside of his wife and daughter, And even if there had been the means and opportunity, it's likely that his own strict, stubborn conservative values may have kept him back from fully forming those relationships. With this in mind, it's no wonder that he didn't have problems imagining female characters, but he didn't seem comfortable embodying female characters in the same way that he did his male characters. And all of this is epitomized in the character of Arwen. Much like the women of Tolkien's life, her greatest impact is made by her absence. She is a character made up entirely by the longing for her presence. She is beautiful, desirable, impactful, but remote. And this type of character does a lot to inform and direct the character that is longing for her, Aragorn, but it does very little to build up an actual substantial person. Now the question is, does this type of character work in the Lord of the Rings books? And yeah, I think so. Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings not to be a modern work of literature, but to be a new mythology for England. And Arwen very much matches, and I would say even improves on, traditional medieval female characters. For the place, time, and context of the Lord of the Rings books, I think she's fine, but then that brings us to the movies. And for a lot of reasons, I think that a direct representation of Arwen's book character wouldn't have carried well on screen. So let's start talking through what they changed and why I think they did that. First off, Arwen's introduction, and this one is a pretty big change. In the books, after being stabbed at Weathertop, Frodo and the lads are met by Glorfindel, an elf riding out of Rivendell. And honestly, in the books, Glorfindel is really cool. He's an elf that plays a large role in the epic events of the Silmarillion, including facing off against the second most powerful Balrog ever, killing it, but then also dying and getting brought back to life, and then that's when we see him in Rivendell, as he's existed for thousands and thousands of years of Middle-earth history. And then in the events of The Lord of the Rings, he's present to provide a horse for this rescue, and to sit in at the Council of Elrond. But then the issue is that those are kind of the only two times we see him in the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. In a book like The Lord of the Rings, a guy popping up for a chapter and then disappearing is totally understandable and happens a lot, because books are much slower paced. You have to sit there and read it, and if you see this guy's name enough, you're going to become familiar with him and accept him as a character, even if he vanishes pretty shortly after that. However, in a blockbuster film, this kind of thing doesn't work as well. Especially in this specific instance, when you are trying to tell a story that is as rich and complex as The Lord of the Rings to an audience that has possibly never heard of The Lord of the Rings, introducing an entire character in one scene and then booting him out of the narrative the next is, I would say, generally frowned upon. So at this point, we are in need of a new elf hero, one that will be in the narrative later on and is currently in Rivendell. So that leaves us with the options of Elrond, Legolas, and Arwen. Elrond and Legolas have plenty of opportunities for screen time and character development later on. But you know who doesn't have those opportunities as much and could really use some development and grounding? It's Arwen. And in my opinion, this was one of the best possible changes they could have made. It really jumpstarts her character, and it allows her to be the first elf that we meet. Especially the specific way that they film it in the movies, having Frodo first see her as this ethereal, eternal being, the thing that she really is. It was just a masterful way to introduce elves into the world of Middle-earth. Arwen is the epitome of elvenness, and I think that emphasizing that early on was actually fairly in line with Tolkien's original vision for the character in some ways. She then gives Frodo a ride to the ford, keeping him out of the grasp of the Nazgul. And in the original text, this is something that just Frodo does, just taking the horse and riding it to Rivendell himself, but I think that having Arwen chauffeur him there was probably not a bad choice. First off, having Arwen rather than the very sickly Frodo make this ride is just, it's a much more intriguing action sequence. And like it or not, The Lord of the Rings is an action movie. so that's probably a pretty good thing. Plus, the logistics of having someone as small as Frodo ride a full-size horse, both in the context of the story and in terms of how that would be a plot hole, and plus just the logistics of finding a stunt double who's small enough to be Frodo, who can actually ride a full-sized horse through that action sequence. It just gets very complicated. Now, this choice does end up stripping Frodo of some of his agency, but if we're just looking at Arwen, I think it's a pretty good start, and it really firmly establishes from the get-go that this character is not the same character as the book. But beyond the flight to the ford, we get a few lovely scenes between Aragorn and Arwen in Rivendell. We get some Aragorn exposition, as well as exposition on their meeting, and it kind of kickstarts their romantic arc. I mean, it's clear that their relationship is made much more overt in the movies, but they were trying very hard to weave an explicitly romantic subplot out of the kind of threads that Tolkien left, and with that goal in mind, I think these scenes did what they wanted them to do. Plus, those scenes are just, you know, they're so pretty. They're just so pretty, man! But beyond Fellowship, things get a little bit more complicated, because now we have to talk about Helm's Deep. Because, as it turns out, originally, Arwen was supposed to be at Helm's Deep, fighting at Aragorn's side. Peter Jackson and his team explain in supplementary materials that Arwen was going to be the reason that the Lothlorien elves arrived, and she was going to fight in the battle. It would be a chance to show off her and her agency in the world, and to just give Aragorn and Arwen a chance to physically meet midway through the films. However, Arwen's appearance in the Battle of Helm's Deep eventually got cut. And while they kind of never specify why, they kind of hint at something, and that is that during the Two Towers, a few on-set shots of Arwen in the Battle of Helm's Deep got leaked on the internet, and the reactions were not so great. There was already a pretty big backlash in the fan base due to her appearances in Fellowship outside of canon, and fans saw this as even more of an invasion into Tolkien's original story. And of course, it's fine for fans to have opinions, but it kind of got a little more personal than that, including it getting to the point where Arwen's actress, Liv Tyler, was crying because some of the comments that she got, and that level of hatred and vitriol is rarely justified in my mind. And of course, they never explicitly stated that that was why they took Arwen out of Helm's Deep, but I can't help but think that that incident kind of played into the final decision. So now, instead of having Aragorn and Arwen physically meet, the team decided to draw on this idea of their kind of psychic mental connection in a series of dream sequences that would allow Aragorn and Arwen to sort of meet and keep their relationship relevant and fresh in the minds of the audiences throughout the trilogy. And I don't think this was an outright bad decision. In fact, it's probably a little bit more in line with Tolkien's original vision, leaving Arwen as a sort of beacon of hope for Aragorn too long after. But then as this progresses, we see shots of Arwen in Rivendell with Elrond, and it kind of turns into this weird will they won't they about whether Arwen is going to stay and marry Aragorn or go off to Valinor. And in the books, this was a decision that had already been firmly made long before this point in the story, and making it more of an immediate decision that's happening in the story is not really a change that I love. In Fellowship, by placing Arwen in a more active and decisive and essential role, they set her at odds with the forces of evil within this world, literally facing them head on. But then, after setting up that strong character with strong motivations and a very solid place in the world, the creators had to significantly shrink the scope and influence of her character. Her concern is no longer the plight of Middle-earth at large. Instead, it's become relationship squabbles between just her and Elrond and Aragorn. Towards the Return of the King, they kind of try and back this up a little, I feel, by claiming that Arwen's fate is somehow tied to the fate of the ring, but not only is this kind of just a nonsensical thing to say, but it's also just not what they've spent the past like 5 scenes establishing. Do I think that placing Arwen at Helm's Deep would have been the better choice? Well, I don't know. I don't know what they would have been able to do with that kind of plot. However, by reversing that choice, they had to very suddenly pivot off of the entire character arc that they had been building since Fellowship, and I'm just not really sure that they landed on something super comprehensible as her new character arc. Still though, even if I didn't love this arc, I think it managed to accomplish one of their primary objectives, which was making Arwen more present by centralizing her love story. No longer is it an afterthought or lost in an appendix, it is a pressing element of the story, something that's especially significant since it's one of the only love stories that we see in The Lord of the Rings. And people may disagree with me here, but I think it was a love story that was sorely needed. From a storytelling perspective, I would argue that it adds dimension and range to these characters, as well as emphasizing some of the themes of the original work, but then also from a business perspective, it was a no-brainer. Just take a quick look at the top billing movies from the time that The Lord of the Rings was being made. No matter their genre, no matter the style or age group that they were writing for, guess what all of those movies have in common? A romantic plot or subplot. The fact is that a lot of people like romance, especially the demographic of people that wouldn't typically be drawn to 12 hours of heavy-duty action fantasy. Emphasizing the love story of Aragorn and Arwen made The Lord of the Rings more appealing and more accessible to a whole new group of audience members, and because I generally like it when people fall in love with Middle-earth, I see that as a net positive. And by making this plot an actual part of the story, we see much more screen time of Arwen, and it makes major steps towards humanizing her character. Arwen in the books is stunning and ethereal and remote. But by showing that she is a character that bleeds, that sweats, that loves, Peter Jackson made major steps towards making Arwen feel real. I can attest from personal experience that that scene at the beginning of Fellowship with the horse chase changed my brain chemistry. For as long as I have memories, I have wanted to be Arwen because of that scene. It wasn't the dream sequences or the long shots of her contemplating her own mortality or even her wedding to Aragorn, although that was enviable. It was that horse chase scene that made me feel like I want to be her because I want to be strong like her. Representation matters. And by expanding and grounding Arwen's characters out of the roots that Tolkien had initially laid, Peter Jackson and his team created a character that was more accessible, more familiar, and more interesting to a whole new demographic of audience members. I love Arwen in the books, but she's not a character I can connect to. How could you when she's a living, breathing fairy tale myth? Of course, was movie Arwen perfect? No, absolutely not. I think they fumbled her character in some very major ways, especially just with establishing a character and then following through on it. But I can't deny that the movie character made a much greater impact on me and my life than the book character ever did, and for that, I am always going to be grateful. I feel this conversation may garner some strong opinions, so I suppose feel free to go off in the comments. Of course, please stay respectful and kind, but I would love to know what you guys were able to get out of these characters, especially because I know that a lot of you are coming from very different experiences than I did. If you did enjoy this video, I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button and shared the video with your biggest Lord of the Rings nerd friend. And if you are interested in Lord of the Rings deep dives and discussions being presented to you for free every single week, I would suggest that you hit that subscribe button, because against all doctor's orders and suggestions, that is the service that I provide. I hope you guys had fun with this video, because I certainly did. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and I hope that you all have a very happy, hobbity day.